Now, what these underlying emerging technologies will allow is major transformations in many aspects of our lives. So autonomous commerce, where machines or agents acting on our behalf are able to connect to, communicate with, and through APIs transact with other elements within the supply chain autonomously, will become very common. So for instance, being able to set rules and policies to say that, when my the stocks of food in my pantry drop below a particular point, I need to automatically go and order more of those to be delivered. And being able to set policies and rules in place like that, that sensors will understand the state of that current thing, the agents that we build will understand the policy that we want to enshrine around that, and the machines themselves will connect and ensure that that occurs. I have a friend who has a beauty products business. They develop natural, beauty products. And for those products, they have a particular recipe that they need to use. Now, there are often, 3 or 4 different options for different elements within that recipe. And when they go to create those products, they have a system that can see what those ingredients are worth on the open marketplace and automatically place an order for the right amount of the right ingredient to be able to satisfy that recipe to be delivered and to allow them to build their kind of product. So those elements of machines communicating will dramatically rise the number of transactions that our systems will need to handle. If you think today of the number of transactions that you personally undertake, whether that be buying things online or going to your local store and being able to buy things, imagine if machines were doing that with other machines on your behalf. Those transaction workflows will go up dramatically and will allow completely new forms of commerce to emerge. We're also seeing, much like your mobile phone, with it has constant software updates, the applications on your phone are constantly changing, new functions and features and capabilities are being delivered around that. We're starting to see that happen in the real world as well, with products having new capability delivered. I have a pair of shoes, for instance, that's made by a New Zealand company, where they'll ship me new types of shoelaces and new types of insoles for different comfort and different style choices, as and when I kind of need it and as they're kind of developed. So even physical products are changing as we go about using them in the real world. The next stage in the big shift that we start to see is this transformation of supply chains to move to anticipatory production. So we've seen a few decades now of leveraging centralized production with very low cost, high volume capabilities. Much of that's done in China or the emerging markets around the world, where the products that we purchase off our shelves in our local stores are actually produced many miles away in different countries and transferred to us over long distances. Now, there are challenges around carbon offsets and footprints around the logistics and supply chain required to do that, but that's been the only way to drive the cost down of those individual components to ensure that they're fiscally capable. With the advent of automated 3D printing, we're now able to manufacture goods on demand in many different substrates, many different metals and polymers are able to be developed through this kind of technology. So you can now have those products created for you as you order them. We're seeing the rise of what we call meta manufacturers, where local manufacturing shops will be able to create these products for you on demand. So they will have recipes that are available that you'll choose. I'll have 1 of those and 2 of those and 3 of those, and that will be manufactured for you and delivered within a few hours. We're using this technology for the US military, where we're having military equipment on aircraft carriers that are around the world, for instance. It's very difficult to supply spare parts to an aircraft carrier that may be in the middle of an ocean. It might be in the middle of a conflict of some type. So having 3D manufacturing machines that are able to print those spare parts using the latest recipe from the manufacturer that could be altered as, for instance, there was an issue with some of the parts for an engine and one of the planes that the US military used. The supplier came up with a new design for that part, literally sent the design out to the aircraft carrier where it was manufactured and fitted to the plane within a few hours to try and overcome that issue. So that sort of on-demand, on-time sort of manufacturing capability will become more and more common over the next decade or so. which leads us to opportunities. So what we've seen over the last decade, especially in terms of telecommunications preponderance, many of the emerging markets that didn't go through the same maturity phases as more mature kind of markets have been able to leapfrog those environments. So, for instance, I do a lot of work with companies in the Philippines or in Indonesia, even in Kenya, where mobile payment, the ability to transfer prepaid mobile credit between accounts on phones and use that as a proxy for money in some markets was emerged long before it did in those emerging markets, much long before it did in many of the more mature markets. There are many clever people around that can find ways to use the technology to create new capability. Things like blockchain can overcome some of the traditional hindrances in emerging markets, where access to quick and easy funding to be able to develop small businesses, access to certified identity, and to be able to track fraud has traditionally been very difficult. I've been involved in the UIDAI product, what's called Aadhaar, Universal Identification in India, and those sorts of capabilities where every citizen has a unique and unique block on the blockchain that identifies them uniquely as a person, that can be used for secure transactions between themselves and the public sector entities that serve them, as well as banks and other insurance companies, to be able to create new products and services in those emerging markets that deliver new capabilities. We see that emerging markets that have traditionally been held back from participating in many of these economies will be able to leapfrog some of those areas and be able to take on. Now, the one common thing around all of these themes is that this is all driven by data. So organizations such as ourselves and yourselves are starting to learn how to store, manage, and protect the information that they have, and then to create those environments that allow that data to be managed and to be for new insights and capability to be driven from that data as it kind of emerges. Now that brings us to the maturity of different countries within kind of Asia Pacific, and we've been tracking this for quite a while. So every 2 years, we run a survey where we look to see how organizations are taking on technology and using that technology to transform their business processes. The first time we did this was in 2016, as you can see, and we saw there that most companies were in that digital follower, digital evaluator kind of phase, where they were looking to see how technology was going to impact their business and starting to build plans for how to adopt that. That had improved in 2018, with more companies moving into that digital adopter phase, and quite a dramatic decrease of companies that didn't believe that technology was critical to them in their business and starting to move forward. The interesting thing we did see, though, is that we expected to see a much greater number of companies that had moved further forward in the maturity cycle. And when we spoke to them, they had invested deeply in this space, but technology had changed so quickly that in fact they'd ended up sliding backwards for every 2 steps they took forward. So it's a game of constant change and making sure that the architectures that you build are able to accommodate those new technologies and take full advantage of them as you kind of move forward. So it has held back some companies and countries in being able to develop that. Now, what we've seen at the moment, obviously, is that there's a dramatic change right throughout the world. And interestingly, John Kennedy had this statement to make at the beginning of the 60s, that the Chinese word for crisis is composed of 2 characters, one for danger and one for opportunity. Now, he's actually incorrect. It isn't made up of that, but it does describe the current environment quite succinctly. On the one hand, we're looking to protect our people and make sure that we minimize the amount of impact that this crisis is having on those around us, but it's also creating new opportunity to create new products and services and to delight and serve the people in our communities and around our environment. And that's been really interesting to see how, when we go back and talk to customers over the last few months, how are their plans changing around leveraging technology, the maturity of their environment, leveraging digital technology to undertake their own digital transformation. How has that changed over the last kind of few months? How is that changing with the priorities that are upon them? Now, interestingly, about 33%, about a third, expected that spending to decrease. And of those, most of them were expecting it to dramatically decrease. So there are a number of organizations, especially in hard-hit industries like tourism and travel, that are literally facing an existential crisis for their business. If they don't change quickly and dramatically lower their cost base, they may not be in business in 12 months' time. So they are very much looking at the bottom line and looking to understand how they can shave costs from their environment. But about a quarter of companies are actually looking to increase their spending. They're seeing this as an opportunity where perhaps the competitors in their particular market aren't as well placed to be able to take advantage of this opportunity. They see it perhaps as a time when they can invest and take the fight to them and take more of that market share that's available in that place. And around 43% of respondees said that they haven't made a decision or they expected it to stay relatively the same. Now, I would argue that those people haven't yet got enough information to be able to make a good decision about which area they should focus on and invest in. This is a very difficult time to predict what the future kind of looks like. Many of the long-term projects that we had in place, and most data center oriented projects tend to look at return on investment of sort of 3, 4, 5 years. Large applications that we go to implement take a long time to implement, to bring into the organization and to be able to drive return on some of that investment out of it. If you're literally looking at an environment where you're not sure if the business is going to be around in 12 months, you really can't invest in some of those large projects. So what we're seeing is people investing in utility type models where they're taking that infrastructure that they need to augment their business and to transform their business, and they're only paying for what they need when they need it. So they're literally taking just enough to get what they can see next month in place, and using architectures that are very simple to expand, very easy to scale, very easy to manage in those kind of changing environments. And we've done a lot of work in helping our customers to transform themselves in that space. The other interesting thing is that there's a 60% increase in companies that understand that their investments in IT are of strategic importance to their business. A decade ago, when I was talking to senior leaders, boards, ministers, often I would get told that IT was too slow to respond. IT projects always ran over. They were never delivered on time, and there was a big trust gap between leadership teams and the IT teams. Over the last sort of 5 years, that's really dramatically changed. So almost all senior leaders that I talk to now understand that the success and ongoing success of their organization depends on their investments in technology and depends on their ability to be able to leverage technology to create competitive differentiation and new efficiencies within their business. And over this period where we've quickly had to take our staff and shift them to working from home, working from a mobile capability, looking at new ways of connecting our supply chains, connecting to our consumers, it's become blindingly obvious that technology is the underlying factor that allows us to be successful in those scenarios. So it's become even more important. Now, interestingly, this is a diagram of what McKinsey call the power curve of any particular market. And all markets kind of look a little bit like this. Generally, in the top quintile, the top fifth of companies capture most of the value in that marketplace. The bottom fifth are the ones that are losing money and are really looking for something else to kind of exit and do. But there's this large swathe of companies that are in the middle of any market that are looking for ways to differentiate themselves and potentially get themselves up into that top quintile to be able to capture more of the value that's available to them within that market. Now, there are two main strategies that companies look to do this. One is what we call innovation by exploitation. So this is getting more efficient, more effective, and cheaper at being able to deliver the goods and services that you know to the customers that you have, or the markets that you know how to serve. So how do you do that quicker, cheaper, and better than you were doing yesterday? The other method is innovation through exploration. So finding new forms of product and services that might be adjacent to the existing offerings that you have to maybe sell more things to the customers that you already know, or to expand your user base to a customer set in a market that perhaps are outside of the ones you're traditionally doing. Now, the research tells us that in a recessionary environment such as the one we're in now, where there are strong headwinds towards kind of success, and there are barriers towards many companies investing in this space, if you put really hard on either one of those, either focus on innovation by exploration or innovation by exploitation, you have a 4 to 5% chance of moving yourself out of that middle group and into that top quintile. However, if you do both of those things, you have a nearly 30% chance of moving yourself into that top quintile. So high-performing businesses and organizations who understand this are looking at how they can get more efficient, more effective, faster and cheaper at what they already know how to do, continue to serve and delight the customers that they know, while taking the information that they are generating and the data that they know about those products and services and marketplaces, and using that data to create new and compelling offerings that allow them to differentiate themselves and to create new capability through explorative innovation. Now, in order to do that, they're leveraging those emerging technologies that we've spoke of at the beginning of those talk, and they're using those technologies to collect more and more information. So they're collecting data about how their consumers are using their products. They're using mobile applications, they're using web-based applications to be able to understand more about how people do that, and looking to that data to create insight about what's going on. They're then using that insight to create those new products and services to differentiate themselves and deliver back into the marketplace a new experience, and perhaps diversify the products that you're working on, delivering those quickly out into the marketplace, and constantly getting feedback from consumers as they use those new products to be able to loop back through the cycle and to be able to drive back through that kind of data-driven kind of pipeline. So data-driven architectures that are driving decision-making and innovation throughout those things. But that is creating enormous pressure on IT. The volume of data and the type of data that we're collecting, large high definition video stores, for instance, or streaming data that's coming from sensors in the environment, very large unstructured data pools of logging data and forensic data that are tracking how people are using the data in the environment, are very difficult for us to store, manage, and maintain. We end up with these, if we're lucky, we get to build what we call a data lake to harness some of that data, but there is still other data that's generated out near the edge of the network, perhaps by those cameras or other sort of high definition devices, that is never going to make it into the data lake, into the core of our network. It's also never going to make it into the cloud where we can build sort of extra capabilities. We have to be able to analyze that at source. We have to be able to build analysis into the ability as we're collecting those data. Those different data pools need to be protected and maintained. They need to be able to scale and grow, and they need to be made available to these new accelerator-driven machine learning environments that are driving some of those AI insight-driven architectures that allow us to take value and capability out of that data. And all of that needs to be managed and operated by our existing operations teams. There's new sets of skills, new capabilities, new operational architectures, new culture, new partners that need to come into that. We start to leverage in a multi-cloud manner, not only our own capability, but capability from our partners, capability from public cloud resources, and a combination of all of those things to be able to get the right set of requirements for our business. So those two are both creating enormous pressure on our infrastructure teams to be able to respond and grow at the speed that our businesses need to, with the right level of reliability, governance, security, and availability to be able to protect those workloads and the value that we're creating as part of that. So we're seeing now most businesses are operating on the core function of agility. They're designing around agility. In the past, even 30 years ago when I started in IT, we would spend much time designing systems based on what we knew about the workloads, the performance of those workloads, the likely growth of those workloads over the next 2 to 3 years. would spend a lot of time doing that because we had to buy physical infrastructure that was capable of handling not only the workloads that we had today, but the workloads that we could predict in the future. That infrastructure was very hard to change. It was damn near impossible to upgrade it with new computing capability, to augment it with new storage capability or new memory capability to be able to handle those workloads. We had to get that right. So we spent a lot of time and effort focusing on those elements. Now those architectures are easy to change. It's easy to be able to change standardized architectures with new processing capability, new accelerators as and when we need them, new memory pools, new memory types now, persistent memory that allows us to take advantage of it in different ways. New storage pools that are both high volume as well as very high performance and near memory class kind of performance technologies for persistent storage that allow us to create completely new data architectures than we'd ever do before. So the infrastructure is now moldable and changeable to meet these kind of needs. We need to design around that agility footprint. The reality is we don't know what the workload's going to do tomorrow. If this project that we're building now is successful, maybe that will become 10 times, 100 times what it is today. If it's not as successful as we hope, maybe it'll only become 5 times faster. Maybe we need to learn from that and be able to change it and be able to do something slightly different. So trying to predict what's going to happen in a month, a year, has become nearly impossible. So we need to drive that level of agility as the core of the decisions that we're making around infrastructure. We need to drive towards integration because to lower that cost on the operations team, we need to make sure that there's a consistent way of working with and operating with the infrastructure pools, both if they're down at the edge, if they're in our core data center, if they're in our partner's data center, or if they're in a public cloud resource pool. We need to have a single set of tools and methodologies and capabilities that we can run across all of that to make it simpler to manage, easier to maintain, and easier to build those governance and risk frameworks across the top of, to understand what data we have and where it is and how it's protected, making sure that it's secure from cyber risk. And if it is compromised for any reason, making sure that we have backups that are available to us to be able to quickly recover those critical records as and when we need to. So understanding where risk lies within our requirement, and having very simple service catalog oriented deployment mechanisms to allow ourselves and our business partners to be able to see and deploy, maintain, manage the workloads to run businesses they need to without having to engage in deep reconfiguration and redesign and resolutioning of the architectures to be able to build that. So have one way of build, run, and deploy on the right cloud for the workload at the right time within its kind of life cycle. So we've spent a lot of time trying to make that easy for yourselves and for our customers kind of around the world by using VMware Cloud Foundation across not only our on-premise resource capability, but also all of our kind of cloud resource pools, whether that be Amazon, Azure, Google, whether it be other kind of partner cloud environments. Having one way of connecting across those and being able to deploy those workloads is absolutely critical. So having that consistent infrastructural view of all of the resources that are available to us and to be able to consume as and when we need to. And then to make that available through that self-service catalog and portal to our users to make sure that no matter if it's a container, if it's a SaaS environment, if it's a virtual machine, if it's a function as a service, or if it's just a raw piece of code that we need to compile and run in a PaaS type environment, that the same portal can be used to deploy those workloads, to manage and maintain them, and make sure that they're at the right place to support their needs at every point within their life cycle. Early on in their development scenario, it might make sense to use a developer-oriented cloud like an Amazon, for instance, with a very rich set of development tools that are wrapped around that. But as that application then begins to collect data and start to build analytics and machine learning models based upon that, then we might want to move it into Google Cloud, where we've got capability like TensorFlow accelerators to be able to drive some of those pieces of the architecture for us. As we start to build that data set, maybe we want to move it closer to an on-premise capability where we've got existing data about our users, but that can't be moved into a cloud scenario. So we want to be able to move it close to that data to get a much wider and fuller insight of our consumer and how they want to use that technology. So even within the case of one application, at different points within its life cycle, it might need to be on different resource pools to meet its performance and cost and availability kind of needs. So having all of those capabilities available to us and the single method of operating and managing that infrastructure is critical to make sure that we can move it to make the best use of what we have available to us as an organization. So that's where we've been putting our time and effort into. Thank you for your time today. I hope that's of use to you. More than happy to answer any questions you might have. But now I'll hand it back to the team to run the quizzes for prizes in the next phase of this webinar.